the next workshop in the 2023-2024 Seal of Biliteracy Professional Learning Series. My name is Candice Black, and I'm your World Language Associate in the Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages of the New York State Education Department. Today, it is my pleasure to present with my co-host, David Mumper, using the SEAL rubrics to evaluate culminating projects and presentations. This webinar will take a deep dive into the 3 modes of communication evaluated in the OBEWL rubric for the SEAL culminating project and presentation. Performance descriptors will be unpacked into their core elements: function, accuracy, context, and text type, so that evaluators can identify the evidence for the demonstrated level of proficiency. During this session, participants will work in small breakout rooms to evaluate portions of sample student work to calibrate their scoring. I have the pleasure today of presenting with a colleague and a friend, David Mumper. David, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and start us off on this presentation?
Sure. Thank you, Candy. This is David Mumper. I see some friendly faces and some colleagues here. I'm not going to shout everybody out because we've got well over 100 people here today. I'm a resource specialist in the Hudson Valley Arborn. And I want you to make note of that institution, the Arborn, because we're going to have that as one of our kind of learning targets today, is that you want to be able to realize that your Arborn is here to help. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to myself or your regional Arborn for your area. So as we said earlier, and you've got the links in the chat, there's a direct shortcut and a QR code to get all the handouts that we have prepared for you today. They'll be of use today and then also as you're calibrating your SEAL programs. This is a snapshot of the OBEWL website. I'm happy to say that if you just search NYSSB, you will go directly to the right page. It's the New York State Seal of Biliteracy. It's worth noting on the left there that there's a number of modules that are already available, walking you through the Seal of Biliteracy really from start to finish. And you see the link down there at the bottom. As we said, here's a link directly to the Google Doc. We've got now almost 130 participants today. So rather than stopping and taking questions as we go along, we'd like to ask you to place them in the document that links to. And then as we get to the end, we'll take a look at those, and then time pending, we can have discussion about those. And if not, we will follow up on anything asked. So our goals for today, firstly, we want to know what the culminating project rubrics are and where you can find them. And we'll discuss what those 4 categories of languages are shortly. We want to be able to explain the 3 modes of communication that we're presenting, sharing, celebrating, and ultimately assessing. We want to describe how the presentations are conducted and the expectations for the student performance. We want to identify the expectations for the panel interview following the student presentation. In other words, after the student has done their part, what does the panel discuss, or what are they actually doing as a group? We want to be able to identify the facts. That's an acronym for the functions, accuracy, context, and text types of language that are performance indicators in the rubric. We want to be able to use the performance indicators on the rubric to evaluate the student performance. And ultimately what that means is that we want to be able to determine, have they reached the level of proficiency that we're asking to earn the Seal of Biliteracy? We want to be able to identify and find the resources that NYSSB has for the project, the culminating project, which is both a toolkit and the modules, which you saw on the screen cap earlier. And as I mentioned, you want to make sure that you know who the Arborn is. That stands for Regional Bilingual Education Resource Network. I represent the Hudson Valley region of the Arborn, and there are others throughout the state. For today's webinar, we're discussing the culminating project and the presentation using the New York State Learning Standards in world languages. However, the information in rubrics apply to projects in all languages. An example that we will use today is presented in English. This way, everyone can essentially follow along the same conversation and discussion. So how ultimately are the projects and the presentations evaluated? So there's a NYSSB approved rubric. It's aligned to the New York State Learning Standards for world languages. Schools can choose to use the suggested rubric, of which you'll see a link here to 3, modern languages 1 and 2, 3 and 4, or classical. You can use a consortium developed rubric, or you can develop your own rubric, which you'll have to submit for approval each year to OBEWL. Most high schools are using the OBEWL suggested rubric, and today's conversation will really focus on modern language 1 and 2. The 3 categories of language that we're referring to are based on roughly, and this is subjective, but the difficulty in terms of learning them. Category 1 and 2 languages tend to be close to English. They use a Roman-based alphabet, and you can see some examples there. Categories 3 and 4, we say linguistically or kind of socio-historically are further away from English. They do not use a Roman-based alphabet, and you can see some examples there. Classical languages are not currently spoken, and that includes Latin, ancient Greek, and ancient Hebrew. The language proficiency target is important to identify because that's ultimately the most crucial question about what we're evaluating when we're going through this process. Does the student meet for category 1 and 2, which would include, for example, English or Spanish? Does the student reach intermediate high? You can see there's a small graphic there under each one. This will be larger later. You can see where it fits on the spectrum of kind of beginner to more advanced and proficient. But we're looking for intermediate high for category 1 and 2 languages, intermediate mid for category 3 and 4. And in classical, we're really looking at interpretive, which we'll discuss later, which is really focusing on reading and interpretation. You can find the suggested rubrics, which again, most high schools are using, on the NYSSB website. It's under Culminating Projects, Presentations, and Rubrics. And here you have a link to each one. So most schools, if you have a Seal of Biliteracy program already, you know this. If you're thinking about starting one, you should know that most schools do use a culminating project as part of the points for the student to earn the seal. There's really 3 parts of that. There's a written portion, there's an oral or a signed presentation, or there's an oral or a sign language interview. It's really important to kind of think conceptually that there's 3 things that we're looking at here. They're not all assessed at the same time, and we'll talk about that a little, but there's a written part, a presentation and an oral part, and then an interview that is discursive and back and forth. So how is the presentation conducted? You can see in the graphic here that student presents the project. This is a monologue. In other words, kind of like what I'm delivering now, where one person is speaking. It's delivered in the target language entirely by the student. Panelists do not intervene, and they only should if it's absolutely necessary, if there's something wrong with the progress of the presentation. Next, the panelists interview the student. This is a spontaneous conversation entirely in the target language between the student and the panelists after the presentation model. I think it's really worth highlighting here that it's spontaneous. That means that you don't plant the questions. The students don't know what questions are coming, although they do have a sense of the format. And finally, the panelists discuss the student performance. So after the student is completed, this is discussion amongst the panelists. They share and discuss the evidence of proficiency. using the language of the rubric that was gathered during the presentation and the interview process. So how do the panelists evaluate the performance? There's three parts. Students are evaluated on all three modes. All three modes are required, and students need to reach the proficiency target for all three. However, they don't all happen at the same time. The interpretive mode, as you can see in the blue graphic at the bottom, is really about how students understand, how they interpret, how they analyze written, spoken, or signed texts. So you can see the picture there of the student and sort of the arrows going towards the person is really about them interpreting language that they are either reading or listening or watching. Interpersonal performance evaluates how well students exchange information in a conversation, respond to questions, engage. Presentational, where you can see the arrow sort of emanating out from the student, is really about presenting information. Again, if you want to think of a model, it's this moment of our webinar now where we have a sort of speaker delivering information. The project is based on input in the form of reading, viewing, or listening. And in the interpretive part of the communication, we're looking at how learners understand, interpret, analyze what they've heard, what they've read, or what they've viewed. And this is, as we'll see later, not necessarily assessed in the moment of the student's presentation. So then when is the interpretive mode evaluated? Basically, their listening and reading skills is evaluated by the classroom teacher or their project advisor prior to the presentation. In other words, if students are at the point now where they're going to be presenting their culminating project, the teacher or someone else involved in the SEAL program at your school will have already assessed if the student's interpretive mode reaches their proficiency. This could be through an exam, a test, or through observation of the student's performance. The presentational communication, where learners present information and ideas on topics adapted to audience of listeners, readers, or viewers to describe, narrate, explain, or persuade, has two parts. Presentational speaking, which is evaluated using the student's oral or signed presentation of the project, and the presentational writing, which is evaluated by the written narrative portion of the project, which is submitted before the day that the student is delivering their presentation. In other words, the panel really has already seen the written or the transcription of the project presentation. The interpersonal mode is evaluated by the panel essentially in two parts. During the interview, as you're asking the questions, you might be calibrating those questions. And then after the interview, where the student answers the questions to varying degrees, there's a discussion about to what extent that interpersonal communication was achieved.
Okay, thank you, David. I appreciate it. So we're going to move on to a deep dive into those modes that David just discussed by talking about some general guidelines that are featured at the top of every OBEWL rubric. In this rubric, we want to make sure that students can be evaluated holistically on these three communication standards. That is, you can gather multiple pieces of evidence. It's used to evaluate both the project itself, which could take the form, for instance, as a scholarly essay or a portfolio, as well as for the oral or signed presentation and panel interview. The interpretive mode, as David said, is generally evaluated prior to the presentation by the teacher or the advisor. And we have often this question, well, why is that? Well, as David said, these interpretive skills of listening and receiving and reading are not generally and directly observable during the presentation. So instead, they have to be evaluated by adults who have the opportunity to observe the student as they develop these skills over time. As David mentioned, the interpersonal and presentational modes are evaluated at the time of the presentation. So students should be evaluated by a panel of reviewers consisting of at least 2 adults who are qualified speakers of the language being assessed. The student's current teacher may serve on this panel, but should not be the sole reviewer of the project and presentation. Schools are encouraged to recruit community members to serve on the panel. It's a great way to build PR, but they cannot be a relative of the student. If the presentation is given in a low incidence language that's not taught at the school, and you can only find 1 adult speaker of the language, then the panel may consist of that 1 speaker, but every effort should be made to secure at least 2 adult speakers of the language. And as David mentioned, the entire presentation and panel interview must take place in the language being assessed. One last general guideline for these presentations before we delve right into the rubric, and that is about linguistic diversity. So we know that we have many students, especially our English language learners and our heritage language speakers, that could come from anywhere in the world. They may speak a language that you speak, but they may speak it slightly differently. And we're going to call this linguistic diversity. We want to make sure then that when we see this linguistic diversity in the course of these presentations, that we avoid lowering any assessment of the student due to, say, a student's accent that may be different from the standard, or their pronunciation that may be different from the standard, or they may be using culturally specific vocabulary. As long as these 3 things don't impact comprehension and negotiation of meaning, then they should not lower the score. So let's take a nice dive, and we're going to do a little poll to get you invested in this process here. Here are the 4 elements of the project itself: presentational writing, speaking, interpersonal communication, and interpretive communication. So we did this graphics to help you better conceptualize this. In red, you have the sections of the project that are evaluated by the panelists. And then in green, you have the portion that's evaluated by the classroom teacher or project advisor. Now we added a different level of difficulty to this. Now in purple, going across, these are the sections that are evaluated prior to the student presentation: presentational writing and the interpretive communication. And then finally in yellow, we have those items that are evaluated at the time of the student presentation: our presentational speaking and our interpersonal communication. So we are going to take a very quick break now to do a Zoom poll. And so if you just give me 1 second, I am going to start a poll for you. So you should see coming up on your screen a poll that says poll for using the CL Rubrics webinar. It's just a short little test of 8 questions. So if you would go ahead and begin taking this, and we'll show you the results to see how you did. We'll give you about 4 minutes to do this. Okay, so great job on number 1. Presentational is done prior to the student presentation. Presentational speaking, however, the first one was writing, is done at the time of the presentation. Interpersonal is done at the time of the student presentation. Interpretive communication is done prior to the student presentation. The classroom teacher or project advisor evaluates interpretive communication, number 5. Interpersonal is done exclusively by the panelists. And presentational speaking portion is done exclusively by the panelists. Presentational writing, again, that's the only one where we didn't have a stellar score in the high 80s or 90s. So let's talk about number 8 really quickly. Who evaluates the presentational writing portion of the project? All portions of the project, with the exception of interpretive communication, which is listening and reading, are done by the panelists. So we had almost even split, but a majority of you said the classroom teacher or project advisor evaluates the presentational writing. While the classroom teacher or project advisor may also serve as a panelist, it's actually the panelists who are evaluating that presentational writing. All right, so I'm going to go back to our presentation. I want to thank you for participating in that. That'll give us a nice primer for diving even deeper into the rubric. So as David mentioned, students must demonstrate at least the required level of proficiency on all 3 modes of the project. So here's a sample for standard 1, interpretive communication of the rubric. We've given you all the way from intermediate low to advanced high, and I wanted to just talk about the different parts of the rubric. So we have the standard, as well as the guiding question for the standard. And then along the top, you'll see in green and orange, proficiency sublevels ranging from intermediate low to advanced high for these, for the rubric itself. And notice that we have color-coded the target proficiency level, which for this category 1-2 language is going to be intermediate high. But then within each of those columns, you have performance indicators or can-do statements. And notice that these can-do statements are broad and skill-based. They are not task-specific. So we're going to take a dive into these, and we're going to use an abbreviation or an acronym to help you remember the important elements of the different parts of the performance indicators. The first one is F, and this is going to spell out fact, F-A-C-T. What is the function that is being referred to within the can-do statement? This is a function word, and it's really easy to find because it's exclusively what follows the I can. So in intermediate mid, the function is understanding the main idea and key information. Intermediate high, it's following the main idea. Advanced low, it's identifying the main idea and the underlying message with supporting details. Okay, so function. The A is accuracy, and this can be a little confusing. Accuracy refers to both comprehensibility and then at the later levels, control. So we don't see anything referred to in accuracy for intermediate mid, because the first time that those national standards, which are New York standards, are aligned to mention any sort of control is at intermediate high. And that's where you get this in various time frames. At the advanced low, the control is expected to not just be in various time frames, but across major time frames. Our C is context. Now, context doesn't exist in the descriptors for interpretive, so we're going to skip over that, but we'll see that in the other modes. The T, in fact, is text type. This refers to the length of text that a student can handle. Is it at the word level, the sentence level, or the paragraph level? So for intermediate mid, we're talking about straightforward informational text. At intermediate high, we're talking about paragraph length text. And in advanced low, we're talking about in-text conversations and discussions. So now that you've gone through this once with interpretive, we're going to take you through the interpersonal. So fact, and I'm going to give you some wait time to identify these in your head. What is the oops, sorry, I went too far ahead. What is the function or purpose for communication in each of the performance indicators? Okay, hopefully you're selecting these first parts that follow the I can about exchanging information. Notice how the progression goes, that it gets more difficult and more detailed as you get higher in proficiency. Our A was accuracy. Remember, that's control. We're not going to see this at the intermediate mid-level. See if you can find it in the intermediate high and advanced low descriptors. Okay, the nice part about it is you're going to see some patterns emerging as you go through these. Various time frames, major time frames. The C is context. Now, we didn't talk about this for interpretive. Context refers to the topic of conversation. Are students only able to talk about things that are very, very familiar to them, or can it be more abstract? Try to locate where it refers to the topic of communication within these performance descriptors. Hopefully you're seeing that intermediate mid can do a variety of familiar and maybe some research topics, while intermediate high can do a variety of familiar, concrete, and research topics. And advanced can do a variety of concrete, academic, and social topics. Remember, our last part of fact is T. It's text type, the length of text. See if you can identify these in the performance descriptors. All right, so intermediate mid, students are using sentences and series of sentences. At the intermediate high level, they're starting to form paragraphs with connected sentences. And then advanced low, they're using a couple of paragraphs. All right, last one we're going to breeze through. I hope you're getting the hang of this. Facts. This is for our presentational communication. Find your purposes for each of these performance descriptors. Hopefully this matches up with what you're choosing. All right, our A is accuracy. Find where we refer to control within these performance descriptors. Remember, it won't show up in intermediate mid. Next one, context. What are the topics that students can handle at each of the levels? And again, I hope you're seeing some patterns here from mode to mode. And finally, our text type. Sentences and series of sentences, short paragraphs, and paragraphs. Now, you may be wondering and contrasting, why is it that students for presentational seem to be able to handle longer text types? If we were to go back to the interpersonal, students are only using sentences at intermediate mid and then strings of sentences at intermediate high, while at the presentational, they're able to do a little bit more. That's because interpersonal is spontaneous, whereas presentational is very often polished. It's something we work on, we revise. Okay, I hope that was very helpful to you. So let's talk about that panel discussion and get right to our practice student. So each student should be evaluated immediately following their presentation or an interview after the student has left the room. Panelists review their notes and then they present evidence and share it with each other using, and this is important, the language of the rubric that they have gathered during that time. And they attempt to come to consensus on the proficiency level. We recommend that the SEAL coordinator collect those completed rubrics from each panelist following the discussion. So what we're going to do is put you in some breakout rooms to view a video. We want to give you some helpful hints before you do that so that you know to pass these on to your panelists. The first thing is make sure that all stakeholders are familiar with the evaluation rubric. Students need to know so that they know what to expect as well as how to level up. Teachers should be encouraged to use these rubrics in class for non-SEAL purposes. Project advisors can use these rubrics to advise students as they develop and practice their presentations. And of course, panelists need to have a familiarity with these rubrics to gather evidence and come to consensus. As the SEAL coordinator, you're going to want to prepare the paperwork for the panel, including rubrics, one per student that you're going to collect after each presentation, and copies of the student's written portion of the project so that the panelists can evaluate the presentational writing. It's also really important to review the student's materials. Either the SEAL coordinator or the project advisor can do this before the presentation so that the student is not caught in a situation which will not give them credit. Specifically, we want to talk about visual aids and notes. So it's quite a common mistake for students to put full sentences on their PowerPoint slides or visual aids. This should be avoided simply because it's very tempting to read. Instead, we want students to just use keywords or phrases in order to avoid that temptation so that they can speak spontaneously. And even better would be to include some type of graphic to illustrate the point. When it comes to notes, we want to make sure that these are looked over by an adult to make sure that they are brief and don't contain complete sentences. And I've given you a bad example here on the importance of water. And then an alternative good example. They contain the same amount of information, but one prompts the student to speak spontaneously and gives them all the keywords that they need, while the other one, the student would end up reading. You're going to want to encourage your panelists to take notes on the evidence observed, and we have a spot provided for that right on the rubrics. Immediately following the interview and after the student leaves the room, again, the panel should discuss the evidence gathered and come to consensus. We want our panelists to specifically reference the language of the rubric, and that's why we went over fact. Remember, function, accuracy, context, and text type. We recommend, again, that the SEAL coordinator collect the completed rubrics for future notification of the student. And if the student isn't successful, there could be an opportunity for the student to represent and use the feedback from the rubrics. Although not required, some schools choose to keep the rubrics in the student's academic file. That's really up to you. Okay, so let's get to the meat of your work today. You are going to watch a student video in English. It has been edited. This video was probably about 30 minutes long. We had to make it reasonable for this. It's about 9 minutes. After you watch the video, you're going to work with your breakout group to discuss the evidence that you observed and evaluate the student's performance so you come to consensus on a rating for the student's presentational speaking and interpersonal communication. As I mentioned, this video was edited. It's provided to us from Buffalo Public Schools, which is one of only 12 schools to pilot the SEAL in 2015-16. You're going to see a notes catcher that I'm going to show you in 1 second, where you can record the rating that you give, as well as summarize any evidence that you gather. So you're going to introduce yourselves to your group, review the task that you have to do, and this involves noting your group number because you'll need that number to be able to get to the right note catcher. You'll elect a timekeeper, but I will also keep you on time. And then each group member is encouraged to watch the video on their own. We're going to provide the link to the video. And then while you watch the video, if you'd like to, add evidence, things that you hear or observe in your note taker. Note that you're only going to observe the presentational speaking and interpersonal communication. You won't be evaluating the student's interpretive communication or presentational writing. You'll discuss for about 9 minutes the evidence that you gathered, and hopefully you'll come to a consensus on the proficiency sublevel. So here's what the document is going to look like for your note catcher. See, this is why you have to note your group number. And you'll click on your group number to access your group's individual note catcher, where you're going to enter in the evidence. And so this looks just like the screen I showed you at the beginning. There's places for you to enter the evidence. If a question comes up that you can't answer, you can put that question in there. We'll review it later. And you'll see pull-down menus for both presentational speaking and interpersonal communication that you can change based on what you think the student's proficiency is. If you want to take a look at the rubrics that we just went over, there's links to that on every note catcher page. Okay, so we are now ready. I want to make sure before I put you in breakout rooms that you have located in the chat the link to the handouts folder. If you have the handout folder link, then you have access to everything. You're going to watch the video and then access your note catcher to be able to take those notes.
So his project is a play, both in Swahili and in English. The characters are fictional, but the events are really based on life as he knew it in the Congo. So it's all about the corruption in the Congo, and we'll let Masada start out with a brief introduction of himself, a little bit talking about his project, some of the resources that he used to create his project, some of his beliefs and his hopes from this project, and his feelings about the process. And after that, we'll have an opportunity to do some questions and answers. We can ask him questions about the project. And then at the end, we will go off as a committee. We'll use our rubric to evaluate and make sure that all the criteria has been met to bestow this honor on Masada. So without further ado, I'm going to let Masada stand up.
I would like to start by giving a brief history of myself. I was born in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Democratic Republic of Congo is a country in Africa. It is the second largest country in Africa. For that, we got our independence from Belgium in 1960, and in 1965 we had a coup d'etat which resulted into a dictatorship which lasted for around 33 years. In 1994 in Rwanda, there happened a big political event which was called as the Massacre of Rwanda. The massacre resulted into many people losing their life, around 1 million. So, and at the end result of it was, the conflict was between two tribes, that was Hutu and the Tutsi. The Hutu were the one which were in power, and their leader was shot. The plane of their leader was shot, and he died, which was called General Habyarimana. After that, the Hutu turned and killed the Tutsi massively. They killed Tutsi, many Tutsis, but at the end of all, some neighboring country supported the Tutsi, and they forced the Hutu to the Congo forest, the Hutu militant which perpetrated the massacre. I was 4 years. Actually, our village was invaded, and around 76 people were killed, of which 36 were just from my family. That was a great loss, but we were lucky that we didn't actually pass away in that case. Now, when I was 8 years, I also survived a massacre. I myself had gone with some peers of mine who were like, I was 8 years. We went to a Christian ceremony, and we traveled using a bus. All my peers were killed. It was not the Hutu, but there was another rebellion in Congo which was called Majimaji Rebellion. They actually killed everybody. I just survived that. I and another child, we were the only survivor, and we were rescued by the Red Cross and taken back home. So I've seen a lot happen to my family and just other people in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Our house was burned. Everything we had was taken away. I have seen people in my family subjected to the rape. So what I have just been talking about in the play is something which I have experienced. And now we made our way to Kenya as refugees. It was a great luck that we made it through and found ourselves in Kenya. Since then, we spent some year in the camp. I never had an opportunity to go to school in Congo. I started my education in class 7, in grade 7. It is like grade 7, and that was in 2010. That was my first time to get an opportunity to education. So the country Congo, we have a lot of troubles, and since the United States allowed us to come and pursue our dreams here, that was in September last year that we got to this country, and I got the opportunity to come to Lafayette, which I liked much. And coming here, I found this opportunity of biliteracy, the seal of biliteracy, of which we had some option to explore. So there was essay option and play option. So I decided to pursue the play because I had that idea. Since from all the experience that I had in Congo and what I've been seeing, I always say I would, one day when I will get a chance of writing something, I will have to write about all what happen in Congo and just some other countries in Africa.
So we will start with questions. If you have questions, anyone have questions for Masada about his play?
I have some questions. It's a biliteracy diploma that you're pursuing, but how many languages do you speak other than, I heard you use the term coup d'etat.
Yeah.
Yes, Masada. So how many languages do you speak in total?
There are like 5 languages. Those I can speak well, and actually 5.
And
That's
those would
English,
be?
French, Swahili, and Mashi, which is my mother tongue. I said English and Kiflewa.
Your English is excellent. Your articulation is remarkable. You should be very proud of yourself.
Yeah, basically, I taught myself English first. The way I learned English was very fantastic because in the camp sometimes it's hard to get somebody to teach you. And but I was lucky to have a Bible in Swahili and a Bible in my mother tongue. I would just compare verses in Swahili and in English, in Swahili and in English, and that's how I learned English. I would make my own book, notebook, copy this word, I just translate, and later I find myself actually knowing some English, and that's how I actually learned English. Any other question?
You said you didn't start school until 7th grade.
Yes.
That's when you started to learn Swahili too?
Yep. That's when I started learning Swahili. Kenya.
How is the education in Kenya? Was that in Kenya?
Yeah, that's Kenya.
Different than it is here?
Yeah, it is very different in many ways. Yeah, first of all, the relationship between teachers and students is very different. Yes, teachers are very liberal, they interact with students, but in Kenya, teachers always they put themselves on a different ground with students, so you can't just interact with the teacher in that way. And the teacher are sometimes they are aggressive, they beat students, they cane students. So I've never seen a teacher caning a student here. So moreover, here I think in Kenya they try to make people learn by memorization. Here I think people learn like practically. Yeah, those are, but any other thing is okay. They are almost the same because the curriculum is almost the same, but it's a bit different.
What did you find to be the most difficult in translating from Swahili to English when you're writing?
Yeah, the most difficult thing is that, in Swahili, there are some words which are actually, you can't actually translate them directly. That's the part which I found difficult. There are some things which have actually, they have their own meaning. You feel it better if you speak it in Swahili. But if you translate it, like there is a phrase that translated, a dying ear does not hear medicine. That one, that's a direct translation. But I couldn't actually get what, I don't know if that exists in English. A dying ear doesn't hear medicine. So that's the most difficult part. Some phrases in Swahili I've had to translate, because when you translate them, they lose the weight of their meaning a bit. They kind of lose it. Yeah, that's.
So you now have 2 extra things in that handouts folder. You have a PDF of this PowerPoint presentation, but you also have the document that you see in front of you, which is a completed rubric for this student. And we're going to use 2 conventions, blue highlighting and yellow highlighting, as we go through these. The blue highlighting indicates where we found a preponderance of evidence for the performance indicator, and yellow is going to indicate where we did not find evidence. Remember that regardless if we have some disagreements between the individual sublevel, as long as the student has hit at least intermediate high in all modes of communication, they have reached what they need to do to get the seal of biliteracy. Okay, so general comments. The student does have a marked accent in English, but it doesn't impede overall comprehension. The student's pronunciation was accurate. It had a few exceptions. We noted this on the transcript. At one point, he said plan instead of plain and loose instead of loss. And there were a few points where the student's voice trailed off. We want you to, ignore that because you weren't physically present for the actual presentation. They had a good degree of language control. There were a few exceptions, in particular with plurals, not saying the S. You might have noticed that French is one of the students' languages, which very often doesn't pronounce those final consonants. And the student was, for the most part, very comprehensible and gave a detailed narrative in which he recounted past events. He also understood all the questions that were posed by the panelists and actively engaged with them as he gave paragraph-level discourse. So this student, as you can see from the highlighting, remember blue is where we found a preponderance of evidence and yellow is where we didn't find it. We have evaluated this student as advanced mid for the presentational mode. So let's dive into what that means. The student delivered a detailed presentation with supporting evidence. So for the function, this is directly taken from the performance indicator, and then we give quotes that support that. So he had many details. He used a variety of related vocabulary, which is listed there. He gave historical details, and he used some complex sentence structures. It was also supported by a clear flow of events, including his brief personal history to the larger historical context. Another part of the function is the student presented arguments with supporting evidence. The student has seen traumatic events happen to himself, his family, and others. He supported this by stating that his village was invaded, a certain number of people were killed, some of them were from his family, that he was the sole survivor of a massacre, and that he witnessed a sexual assault committed against one of his family members. In terms of the context, the C, he had to perform at presentational or at advanced mid and demonstrate that he can communicate on a variety of concrete academic and social and professional topics. These included his personal history, the massacre of Rwanda and the violence that occurred, how the student taught himself English, and why the student decided to pursue the seal of biliteracy. For text type and accuracy, we put these together. The student had to use organized paragraphs across major timeframes. So we know that the student spoke using paragraph level discourse. We saw this on the transcript. And they used various timeframes rather accurately. There were some isolated exceptions where he might have said something like they are happened, but I gave you an example where he is using present, he's using past as well. So now we do a double check when we try to calibrate the student's performance. That was advanced mid, that's where we found evidence. But just to be sure, we went to the advanced high performance descriptor and we looked at it. And now we need to compare that evidence we gathered. And remember, I'm highlighting in yellow what I didn't see consistent evidence for. So the presentation was detailed, but I don't know that I would call it cohesive. The student had arguments with supporting evidence, but I thought some of it could have been clearer in the delivery. The narrations were detailed, but I wouldn't call them complex. And the student presentation was on a few topics. We've listed them here, but those topics weren't necessarily abstract or in a specialized field, and he didn't deal with any hypothetical situations. So we want to highlight that while there may be some difference in how different panelists rate a student, that the point is whether the student met at least the target proficiency level. So you may have rated the student as advanced high or advanced low, where I rated him advanced mid, but the point is he met intermediate high, so we can give him the seal. David, can I turn it back over to you to wrap us up?
Sure, thank you. Folks, I was checking the question catcher and also the chat. And so I just want to say that it appears that all the documents you need are back in the folder. And as Candy just said, very importantly, you have a PDF of this entire presentation now. So really the thing that you'll want to do if you have time, and it really will only take a few more minutes, is to watch the video, even parts, if you will, just so that you can kind of hear what the nuance that Candy was teasing out, because that's really the meat of the goal here. And also I think it's worth noting that he was at least one level higher than the minimum proficiency. So just as you're kind of calibrating your program, that's I think important to note as well. So there's questions in the note catcher. We'll get to those. You can also put them in the chat. I know we're over time, but I'm just going to keep going because we have time. I know Candy has time. So if you're here and you want to stick around, we'll do so. There's a toolkit, and you see here the modules. It is full of really excellent information. These are videos. They're kind of multimedia. There's a lot of information in there. Module 5 is preparing for the presentations as we saw today. Yes, there we go. We're going to continue this series on March 20, training panelists to evaluate the culminating projects and presentations. April 10th, demystifying the end of the year data submission. That's where you essentially report on your students, your subgroups of students, other information. And then already existing are some of the past webinars that you can click on there. All of these go into a level of detail that we did today on different aspects of the seal. Candy runs an Seal of Biliteracy forum. The QR code is there. If you are really hungry for more information or more detail than we could get at today, that's a great forum for you to ask questions, to get support, to network with other coordinators. And let me just say that on that note, I think probably the best way to do this kind of learning is to really witness or participate or intervisit a school who has a strong program already. We're happy to help you find those if that's something that you would like, or if you have colleagues who urge you to do that. You CTLE credit for those, and they meet via Zoom. And as we said, our last target today, which is fairly straightforward, if you go back one more, Candy, there, that's the list of the Arborns throughout the state. I happily and proudly represent the Hudson Valley in the blue region there, but you can see where you're located, your Arborn is located. In some ways, it's important if you're in a further upstate or out west area where there's less linguistic resources, or the resources are sort of further spread apart. Your Arborn may be very crucial. Somebody asked a question earlier, can the Arborn help with things like finding panelists and things like that? And the answer is yes. And typically also your BOCES will do that, and in some cases even have a COSER so that you can probably find what would turn out to be the best cost if you need to contract someone for any services. Here's our seal kind of point people throughout the region. Oh, I didn't notice that graphic. That's pretty great. You can see me there in the Hudson Valley and my wonderful colleagues from Long Island all the way out to Buffalo. So our goals for today, just to be clear, and if you didn't get them, or if any of the tech glitches made you feel as if you missed some of it, here's where you can go back and find. You want to know where the rubrics are. There's the links there. You want to know that most of the languages that we're assessing in the state are category 1 and 2, although there's a rubric for 3 and 4 in classical. You want to know what the 3 modes of communication are, describe how we do the presentations, and what the expectations for the panelists and for the interview is. That FACT acronym, I think, is very helpful because as you look at a rubric and you're trying to tease out where they're at, it allows you to say, okay, to what extent did this candidate establish the context for his speech? In other words, what are we referring to? What's the kind of worldview that I'm in? What's the purpose of my text? What's the function? And number 6, I can use the indicators to evaluate the performance, and most importantly, to determine if they're ready to earn the seal. We have the resources here. I know there's a number of questions in the chat about them. I just double checked right before jumping back in here. Yes, they're back in the handouts folder. Thank you, whoever returned them. And if you need help, the Arborn is here. We'll leave our email, my email, and your local BOCES.